Welcome to the Great War Discussion Group once again. The speaker for today is Christine Webster, who has the distinction of being perhaps the only person among the volunteers, other than Stan Parsons, who actually has a PhD in history. She got her PhD from the University of Vienna. She came to this country on a Fulbright scholarship and took a master's degree at UMKC in American history. At that time, she met Stan Parsons. She also met her future husband, and she's been here ever since.
Yes, that's very true.
Christine is going to educate us about something that everybody has forgotten, which is why they call him the Forgotten Pope, Pope Benedict XV, who was Pope all during the war. Christine,
that's right.
On.
Thank you. I usually go by the name Christl, but my official name is Christine. Thank you for the nice introduction. Yes, Pope Benedict is the Forgotten Pope, and I used this title in adaptation of the only English language biography that I could find. The title is probably appropriate because both his predecessor and his successor reigned for longer periods of time, and both his predecessor and his successor had the name Pius. So he falls in the middle and that's probably one reason. But he reigned during a very significant time. In the center of the slide, you see Benedict XV's papal seal that's specific to his papacy. I included within my presentation some information about how the modern papacy came to be, and that happened really between the years 1848 to 1870. My sources, I want to talk about them a little bit, is the only language biography I could find by John Pollard, a rather slim volume, and only a few chapters deal with the papacy. This article by Terry Philpott in a National Catholic Reporter was somewhat helpful. David Kurtzer is an authority on modern popes and has written on various 20th century popes. I found bits and pieces in David Stevenson's volumes on the war, and I was surprised that Scott Burke's biography of Wilson did not contain much about Pope Benedict. This volume is very interesting to read because it gives, by Philip Jenkins, because it gives a much broader perspective of the various religious denominations and not only Christianity about the attitude towards the war when it started and when it ended. I then also came upon a C-SPAN lecture by Hillsdale College in Michigan, and I tied everything together and put it into context with the help of Wikipedia. So let's start. Here are a few facts about the papacy today. It's the oldest and continually functioning international institution. The papacy begins with Peter the Apostle. He was crucified, and the saying goes that St. Peter's Basilica was built on top of his grave. He is the spiritual head of the Roman Catholic Church. That's approximately 1.3 billion members. The Pope is Bishop of Rome, and that is his principal role. All the other bishops are appointed by popes. So, he is primus inter pares among the bishops. He's also the symbolic head of Christianity. And he is also head of state of Vatican City, with its total of 1.9 square miles, which is an enclave within Italy. And in the reference in diplomatic language, the Vatican is called the Holy See. You may have heard that. Here is a map of the Vatican city-state as it exists today. At the top, we have the coat of arms of the popes. And this is based, you have it also on the Vatican flag. And this is based on Matthew, Jesus saying, I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. If you go to the Vatican these days, you know it's located in the northwest corner of Rome. Peter Square here, St. Peter's Basilica, the Vatican museums, you'll extend up here. The Apostolic Palace, where the popes often appears on Sunday afternoon. If you have an audience, this is in an exterritorial area of the Vatican, in the Paul VI audience hall, where the Pope holds general audiences. You may also be surprised that the Pope has its own army, the Swiss Guards, its own post office, its own radio station and television station, its own newspaper, the Osservatore Romano, and is independent. It has negotiated agreements with the state of Italy, how it is provisioned. But let's go back to the previous slide. Oops, I'm going wrong way. The Vatican now is a microstate, but that wasn't always the case. Let's go back 175 years to the year 1848, and you will see that the Pope's territory encompassed a large area of central Italy, from the Aegean Sea to the Tyrrhenian Sea, with Rome being the capital. The rest of the Apennine Peninsula was dominated by various kingdoms, dukedoms, city-states, and the Austrian Empire. 1848 is also an important year for other reasons, because that was the year of when revolutions ravaged all of Europe. And the revolution didn't stop at the Papal States. I will talk briefly about what happened to the Papal States and then address the situation of the rest of Italy. The Papal States were, of course, under the control of the popes, the bishops, and the large monastery. Most of the population in the Papal States was dependent on the bishops, the clergy, for their livelihood, and they were ruled in a rather authoritarian fashion. So when the word of revolution, freedom, liberty spread, it also spread into the Papal States, and it reached Rome. The Pope feared for his life and fled in the middle of the night to Italy, to Sicily, in the little town of Gaeta, and pleaded with the French president, Louis Napoleon, to send troops to Rome so that he could return and protect him. The French have always been protectors of the church. Think of the popes being in Avignon 600 years earlier. So he did comply with Pope's request and sent troops. The rest of the Papal States were absorbed by the reunification movement. The Pope, when he returned to Rome for the first time, did not return to the Quirinal Palace, which is the official residence of the Italian presidents nowadays, but he went to live in the Vatican. He was basically isolated and would not have lasted had it not been for the French troops providing his security. The rest of Italy was dominated by various empires, kingdom, dukedoms. And when we look 13 years later, most of the Apennine Peninsula is unified. Giuseppe Garibaldi was one of the great leaders of the unification movement, with the exception of the area around Rome and Venetia, which still belonged to the Austrian Empire. All of Italy was united in the kingdom of Italy. This kingdom was rather anti-clerical, and there was open hostility between the Pope and in Rome and the king, because when the Italian kingdom was proclaimed on March 17th, 1861, they also proclaimed Rome as the capital, but they couldn't move into Rome because French troops protected the Pope. So they took up temporary residence in Florence. Changes happened in 1870 when the Prussia-French War broke out, and then Emperor Napoleon needed his troops to help fight the Prussians. So he withdrew the French garrison, and the Pope was unprotected. As a consequence, Italian troops stormed Rome, and the Pope completely withdrew into the Vatican. He called him from then on until the year 1929. The popes called themselves prisoners in the Vatican. Let's look quickly before we go on at what the major religions in Europe were around 1900. Everything you see in pink is one form of Protestantism, another Lutheranism, Calvinism, the Church of England, of course. The blue areas, beginning in Ireland, sweeping through Spain and Central Europe, was Catholic. The green areas was the Russian Orthodox Church. It distinguished itself out of nationality reasons from the Greek Orthodox Church, which was located here. And the orange areas that you see were Muslim areas. One major religious group that is not represented, but was widely present at that time, were the Jews, which were mainly located in Central and Eastern Europe. And now let's talk about our main subject, Giacomo Paolo Giovanni Battista della Chiesa. He was born on November 21 in Genoa. He was at birth a weak child. He always walked with a limp. He was undersized. His growth was stunted. He never felt very comfortable in his own physical person. And he called himself at various times ugly. So he certainly had some type of complex. But he was smart, and he was born in an impoverished aristocratic family. His father required that he obtain a Doctor of Law degree, which he did. And he then entered the priesthood, and he studies at the Diplomatic Academy in Rome. That academy college is designed to develop clergy for serving in various functions within the Vatican, in the Curia, the Vatican administration, and also on foreign assignments. He enters the diplomatic service in the Cardinal Secretary of State's office. The Cardinal Secretary of State's office is next to the Pope, the most important office within the Vatican. And quite a few Cardinal Secretaries of State later became popes. I will refer to it later again, but you may think of Pius XII and Paul VI. He then is posted at the Nunciature, which is the Vatican speak for embassy in Madrid, for 4 years, then returns again to Rome and serves in various positions until 1907, when he's appointed Archbishop of Bologna. A diocese is an area under the responsibility of a bishop. And at that time, the Diocese of Bologna had about 700,000 residents, most of whom were, of course, Catholic, and about 100 parishes. As Archbishop, he distinguished himself by his kindness, by his being very approachable, by caring for the poor, by making a point of visiting all the parishes and becoming really a shepherd of his people. And then keep that date in mind. On May 25, 1914, he was created cardinal. Cardinal in Catholic Church is the top rank of bishop under the Pope. Cardinals are the people who elect a pope after the death of the previous one, or resignation of a previous one. So let's now go to the year 1914 and the papacy. It is totally, when we look at it, it's totally Europe-centered, religiously, politically, diplomatically. The popes were very little interested in what happened outside Europe. But then on August 20, Pope Pius X dies. This is about 3 weeks after World War I begins. And according to schedules, the cardinals had to meet within 10 days to elect the next pope. And the procedure is called the conclave, meaning the cardinals are locked up and cannot communicate with the outside world, but it doesn't mean that they don't interact very intensively with each other between the voting cycles. The voting itself takes place in the Sistine Chapel. At that time, there were 65 cardinals. The 3 American cardinals didn't make it in time for the conclave, and the majority of the cardinals were Italian. So it was a good likelihood that the next pope would be again Italian. There was a strong division among the cardinals between the anti-modernist and the progressive camps. Anti-modernism, promoted by Pius XI, meant strict adherence to the traditional, to the literal word of the Bible, adherence to the Catechism, which is the handbook of rules of the Catholic faith. It opposed any scientific investigation into the Bible. As a matter of fact, Pope Pius X fired numerous professors at theological faculties and seminaries that were progressive in their views. But all the cardinals were in agreement that the next pope needed to have diplomatic, pastoral, and curial, which means administrative experience. And as it happens so often, the compromise candidate wins, and Benedict XV is elected, or Giacomo della Chiesa is elected pope. He was 16 when he was elected, and then he took the name Benedict. Now look at the photo on the right, which is one of the few photos that exist. And you see that the small person really doesn't fit on this pompous throne. There is something that just isn't right. So it underlines the physical small persona of the Pope. He was crowned on September 6th in the Sistine Chapel. Nowadays, coronations take place in St. Peter's Basilica, but at that time, there were no relations between the Kingdom of Italy and the Vatican, so everything is held very private. He belonged to the progressive faction of the College of Cardinals, and from the very beginning, he promises the Catholic Church will remain neutral in the war, and he vows to promote peace to ease the suffering. He makes some important diplomatic appointments quite early after his election. The name Pietro Gaspari becomes Secretary of State. He also was Secretary of State under Benedict's successor, Pius XI. And he was the one who negotiated the Lateran Accords in 1929 with then the fascist government of Italy, which normalized the relations between the two countries. Prior to that, the Pope had very few rights or outside connections. He was permitted to have engagements with foreign countries if he wished to, but that was on a very limited basis. Also, the Italian kingdom prior to 1929 tried to reimburse him for the losses of territory, but the Pope rejected that offer. The second person of note that he appoints is Eugenio Pacelli. He is the future Pope Pius XII, and of course ruled or reigned during the next Great War, which was World War II, and the photos are here. What are his peace initiatives in 1914? On September 8th, he issues a call for peace that was 2 days after his election and right during the battle at the Marne. So the Pope was aware what was going on in the wider world. And then on November 1, he releases an encyclical, which is a letter to all the bishops. And the bishops have to read it, are supposed to read it and distribute it to their clergy. So it's a worldwide address. And he calls the war in that letter the suicide of Europe, and says what from his perspective the reasons are for the war. That is class warfare, the chasing after material goods, and thirdly, greater independence, which means both political, economic, civil independence or freedom. But he offers no solution on how to end the war. On December 7th, he's the one who calls for the Christmas truce, which was observed, as we know, on the Western Front, but not universally. How are the Holy See's relations with the major powers at the beginning of the war? Well, no doubt about it, the papacy gains international status as a result of the outbreak of the war, because it is not bound by any country through any treaty. And there are large populations among all belligerents. France has a very anti-clerical Republican government and no official relations with the Holy See. Neither has Italy. Great Britain, though, sends a representative after the outbreak of the war. There are tensions with Russia and the Orthodox Church because the Pope believes that the Tsar would want to turn the territories captured from the Ottoman Turk into from Islam to Orthodox Christianity. Austria-Hungary is very loyal to the Pope and has, of course, a representative. Germany has no official relations except the states of Prussia and Bavaria, who have nuncios, exchange of nuncio. And Switzerland is worth mentioning because the Vatican established a special mission there to deal with humanitarian efforts, as we shall see. And there is no representation at the Holy See by the United States. So what are his peace initiatives in 1915 to 17? He opposes Italy's entry into the war on the side of the Allies, but on the other hand, all the population is Catholic and has a government to follow. So he is very torn. But in the end, he encourages the population, the Italians, to follow the war efforts of their government. He grants an audience to members of the International Congress of Women, and I mentioned that because its president is Jane Addams. They had a meeting in The Hague and then went to Rome. And it's therefore certain, although I couldn't find actual documentation, that she was present at that audience. He criticizes the Ottoman government for the cleansing of the Christian population. So the perspective of the Pope widens as the war continues. He also supports the Easter Rising and gives Ireland its blessing once the independent republic is established in 1921. He rejects the German peace initiative, of 1916, which would have returned everything to the status before the war, with the exception of restoring Belgium. He also supports the Balfour Declaration. That's, of course, the declaration by the British Foreign Secretary advocating a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. What I found interesting, that I couldn't find a comment on the liberation of Jerusalem from Ottoman rule by the British. But obviously, he must have been aware of that. And throughout the war, he appeals for the protection of the civilian population from bombardments. The highlight of Pope Benedict's peace efforts were his peace note on August 1, 1917. And I juxtaposed it with President Wilson's 14 points, which he proclaimed 6 months later, because Wilson adopted many of the points that Benedict put forward in his address. The reduction of armaments, international arbitration, which is League of Nations, freedom of the sea, the various issues concerning occupied territory, like the establishment of an independent Poland, a return of Alsace-Lorraine, the Italian border, the Habsburg successor states. All these are contained in Wilson's address in greater detail. What is not addressed in Wilson's address, and neither in the Versailles Treaty, are those two items are highlighted in red: reciprocal renunciation of war indemnities and examination of territorial claims in a conciliatory spirit. So what then was the reaction to this note by the Pope? France regards his initiative as anti-French. It still blamed the Pope that he did not make a stronger protest when the Germans devastated Belgium and northern France. Great Britain objects to the peace note. The United States, President Wilson, rejects the Pope's proposal, stating that we cannot take the word of the present rulers of Germany as a guarantee. Italy is strongly opposed, for one thing, because it doesn't want any diplomatic involvement by the Vatican in peace negotiations. Germany initially shows interest in this peace initiative, but with the events in Russia in October of 1917 and Russia basically ending the war, pulling out of the war, and Germany only having to fight in the West, makes the Emperor Wilhelm believe that the Pope is biased towards the Allies in any way. And Bulgaria, the other two Central Power states, are supportive of the peace note. Then we need to talk a little bit about President Wilson and the Pope, because the Vatican reacts very negatively to President Wilson's 14-point statement, although Wilson adopted so many points from Wilson, and it calls the proposal to reduce armaments and impose international arbitrations through a society of nations a dream, although the Pope himself promoted such an idea in his 7 points. He rather believes that ending conscription would end the war. And then a historic event happened on January 4, 1919, because on that date, the Pope and President Wilson meet at the Vatican. This is the first meeting between a US president and a Pope ever. And from the little information that is gained, it was not a very cordial meeting. For one thing, neither spoke the language of the other, so they had to negotiate via translators. Wilson regarded this audience simply as a courtesy visit, whereas the Vatican wanted Wilson's consent to participate in the negotiations at Versailles, which Wilson rebuffed. Then let's talk a little bit about humanitarian efforts of the Pope. He issues a decree calling that the prisoners of war get the spiritual and material assistance that they need. In 1915, an office is established within the Vatican to deal with POW and MIA issues. And I want to let you know that by the end of the war, the Vatican had handled 600,000 pieces of mail of prisoners of war, 170,000 inquiries about missing persons, 40,000 appeals for repatriation of sick POWs. In addition, he appeals to the US clergy for funds to feed the children of Belgium. I could not find out whether there's a connection between Herbert Hoover's efforts, the Commission for the Relief of Belgium, and the papal efforts, but they both were in existence, similar to the food assistance efforts after the war, which also were continued by Hoover. I could not find any confirming information that there was collaboration between those two bodies. In total, the Vatican spends 82 million lira in relief work. I cannot translate that. For one thing, lira no longer exists in Italy, but it emptied the Vatican treasury. And I have to add to this that when I talked about Switzerland earlier, the Vatican in Switzerland established hospitals to house convalescent POWs. And there were about 26,000 POWs and 3,000 civilian detainees received treatment in Swiss hospitals by 1917. So a considerable investment by the Vatican. And I added this quote from the encyclical of the Pope in the year 1917 because it reflects the entire tenor of the population of mainly Europe, turning away from the promises of victory, of spiritual salvation, and a turn towards skepticism, he says paganism, and disappointment and discouragement. How does the Pope and the world fare in the post-World War I era? Well, he urges Catholics to pray for peace and the negotiators in Versailles. He calls the Treaty of Versailles vengeful and states in 1920 that neither the treaty nor the League of Nations are based on Christian principles. And he asserts that the Catholic Church has a role to play in world affairs. And if you look at in the paper on the news at any time, the Pope is in the hospital, we all know about it. Everybody has it in some form reported. So the Vatican is an international organization. The Holy See is not allowed to join the League of Nations, though. But the Pope finds other means to keep contact with other countries. So he sends his Archbishop Archilarate, the future Pope Paul Pius XI, his successor, as apostolic visitor to Poland and Lithuania. And then he appoints the future Pope Pius XII as nuncio to Germany. He also revitalizes mission work, which was not happening during the war. But what he emphasizes is that the missions be headed by local native organizations rather than by Europeans. So give them more independence, allow them to incorporate their own traditions and cultures in their work. He repairs relations with France. He canonizes Joan of Arc, so we know her now as Saint Joan of Arc, and he reestablishes relations with with France. He improves relations with Italy. He allows Catholics to participate in Italian politics. The previous Pope, or the Pope, as long as Italian men could vote, the popes did not permit Italian men to vote. That was a sin. So this is a huge change, an opening in the vision that the Pope is developing. And he even supports the establishment of a Catholic party, political party. He also expresses concerns about survival of Christianity. He is aware of the Mexican Revolution, and which broke the power of the Catholic Church that it had for the past 300 years. Then, of course, the Bolsheviks and communists crushed the Orthodox Church in Russia. And then he's very concerned about the left-wing uprisings throughout Europe in the immediate post-war years that are, of course, non-Christian, they are atheist movements. So what is then the Pope's legacy? Well, his diplomatic efforts did not bring much, but they increased papal prestige. For example, when he became Pope, he had exchange of embassies with 14 countries. By the end of his reign, there was exchange with 27 countries. He establishes a congregation for Oriental churches at the Vatican because he's worried what the Bolsheviks and communists may do to the Oriental Church in the East, in Eastern Europe. He's also known as the Pope of Missions, as we have seen. He promulgates the Catholic Church's first comprehensive code of canon law, which means the papers, letters, bulls, decrees over which that state over which areas the Catholic Church has jurisdiction for the first time is presented in a comprehensive and organized manner. He supports the Save the Children's Fund throughout Germany and the successor states of the Habsburg monarchy. And he dies rather unexpectedly after a very short illness on January 22nd, 1922, at the age of 67. You'd think, I'm sure there is a monument to him somewhere in Rome or in the Vatican, but I was touched to find this one in a rather unexpected place. It is in Istanbul, of all places, and it is given to the Pope as a token of gratitude from the peoples of the Orient. So not necessarily Christians, but people being aware that the Pope not only helped Christian, but other faith communities during and after the war. And that ends my presentation.
Christl, that was very good. I think most of us had simply never really considered the role of the papacy nor what happened to it during the war. And it's a very interesting story. Thank you for bringing it to us.